Namaste and welcome to India That is Bharat. In this segment, we bring to you the wealth of Indian tradition, culture, and heritage. And today we are going to discuss a very important subject heritage theft. To talk to us about it, we have with us Mr. S. Vijay Kumarji. He is the co founder of the India Pride Project and he's also written a book, The Idol Thief. Vijayji, namaste. Welcome to New India Junction. Without much ado, we'll get straight into the conversation. Please tell us a bit about your background and your journey up till the founding of the India Pride Project.
Thank you. I'm basically a cost accountant and a chartered shipbroker, and I work in the shipping industry. So that's the day job. I'm based out of Singapore, but I'm originally from Chennai in South India, Tamil Nadu. And I basically stumbled on temple art as a basic interest in art and iconography. So I'm not formally trained in either art history or archaeology, but it's largely self-taught. And lucky, I think there are a lot of experts who've written wonderful works, books about art. So basically, what I wanted to do was try to be a bridge because most of the books that I had read were written for a rather advanced audience.
Hmm.
So to me, they sounded as PhD theses written for advanced subjects. So what I had intended to do was to come up with a kind of a dummy's guide to Indian art. I've been interested in temple art since young, and I moved to Singapore in 2006. So before that, I used to travel across India, covering a lot of sites, interested in art and photography. So didn't know what to do with it, but there was a good collection of sites and stuff that I had wanted to share with people. I was writing in these forums into a blog site, bilingual in Tamil and English, trying to encourage early audiences to not just look at it from a spiritual aspect, but more like an art education aspect, where to encourage people to stop and look at the beautiful art that is spread all across India. At some point, when I started blogging about all these, the good thing that happened was some of the it was like a pool into which I was fishing, and I managed to collect a lot of good, well-intentioned, similar-minded people. So it was a small group, about 4 or 5 of us. We would pick a site, 7 to 10 days, go and properly document it. We would give a copy to the ASI, of course, and then that's when we realized, when we visited these sites, that a lot of places the even the documented sculptures were not where they were supposed to be, and that's when we asked very simple questions. We were told no, it's been moved to a museum. Then we would go to the museum, and then we were guys who would travel 100 kilometers to see just one sculpture, and that sculpture was not there. We used to chase it down, and then say it's in the shed and all that. So something was not right.
Hmm.
So that's one part. That's when we were exposed to what was really happening, because for a long time we've seen, all of us have seen idols being stolen in movies, and we thought it was stuff of the 70s and 80s, not anymore.
Yeah.
And that was when we realized that something was happening on current basis. And to combine it, we also realized most of the sites that we went to, even the local people were unaware of these beautiful 1,000-year-old edifices that are there, but there was no awareness, there was no pride about that. No, they didn't look at it as a contribution of their ancestors. So there was a lack of awareness among the people, and the next generation was blissfully unaware. Or a Jain Murti from a Buddha sculpture. So then they realized that there is a lot of gap on art, iconography aspect, and this was being leveraged by the gray market, who basically, you don't value stuff that you have in your backyard, literally. And that's when we realized that something was amiss. And that was a time when social media was booming in a big way. Facebook, Twitter was coming up in a big way, and we started forming very focused groups so that we could widen from our 5 and 10 people into larger bases. We've documented possibly the largest collection of dispersed art across the world. So this could be from museums, it could be from art auctions, markets, storefronts, and all that. Similarly, we also started collecting what was the published material that was currently available. If you want to work with us or volunteer with us, if you find an old book, buy it, keep it with you. If you find an auction catalog, buy it, scan it over to us. The book remains with you. So we basically build a knowledge archive. And then comes the hard part in trying to match the knowledge archive with the theft database. So, for example, we were in a site, in a very famous site in Tamil Nadu when um, the local people said, "Oh, there's a ruined temple nearby. You want to go?" And we were walking towards it, and they said casually, "Yeah, about a month ago they tried to rob a sculpture there. We managed to stop it." And this was in 2007, 2008. And then we realized what's happening now. From this was an ASI protected site, and that's when we realized that yeah, this is something that is real and happening.
Hmm.
And we started researching the background about why this is happening. Inquisitive to understand the economics of the art market. Why is it that our art is so valued abroad?
So we are all aware that there was massive plunder of our cultural heritage and wealth in the colonial times. What also happened was an interest in the Orient, and there was scholarship built around it during the colonial times and also in the post-colonial times. Do you think that also contributed to the plunder?
I think colonial objects or rather conquest objects as war trophies has been going on
Hmm.
since time immemorial. So you basically, even if you go back to our old literature, our own kings basically brought back victory trophies.
Hmm.
So yeah, it is something that happens when you basically these are signs of conquest. So how
Hmm.
do you look at it now is a question that for me, the biggest problem is how the collecting histories of these objects have been erased. I like to point a few examples because for me, that is what is important. Whether you return an object or not, by erasing its history and erasing its collecting history, you're basically you're doing a disservice to the community which actually owns it. So if you go to a typical South Indian temple, so you will have what is inside the sanctum, the immovable god, and then these bronzes that are the Utsav bearers, basically they come out in procession. So they are the movable deities. These movable deities will be woken up, they would be bathed, they would be dried, they would be clothed, they would be ornamentation be put on, they'll be ceremoniously fed, they'll be sung to festivals will happen to them, marriages would happen to them. Then in the night, for example, they'll be sung to and put to sleep in their own bedrooms and all that. So the priest would literally take care of them as living gods, and that's why we call them Tirumeni's. So what happens is around the 14th, early 14th century, there is an invasion from the north that comes in, and there is a visible threat to the temple. So the stone murtis were broken, the bronzes were melted. So to protect these gods, the agamas actually also provide for that. So these agamas are the religious canons that talk about how to cast icons, how to worship them, how to install them in temples. But they also mention that in case of a hostile threat, this is how you can protect these gods. They basically mention how you can dig a pit,
Hmm.
put them, line it with charcoal, kusagras, and then face down, bury the idols. Sorry, use of the word idol murtis. And then after the threat is passed, you bring them back and put them back into worship.
Hmm.
This happened. So basically, the custodians, if they don't have time to do all this, if the threat is too immediate, they would throw it in a temple tank or a pond
Hmm.
nearby, just to safeguard these. But for some reason, we keep getting these buried hoards in South India. Till date, every year we get about five or six such hoards. So when I say hoards, collection of buried murtis and the accompanying paraphernalia. We call it the processional, whatever is the vessels, utensils, and all that. Defies logic as to why somebody would go to such extent to safeguard them and not bring them back to worship, because hardly the theft stayed for about a month to 6 months max. So what stopped them from not bringing them back to worship when they took so much of effort to basically bury them? That the custodians were killed or they were driven so far away that they
Hmm.
could never come back, which to me defies logic. So even today, we get every year we get many of these buried hoards that are unearthed. But sadly, they are being trafficked out of India because these are the finds are not reported.
Hmm.
People. they're paid pittance, but they are being taken out. So, to such an extent, there is an active market that is happening. Now, cut back to the colonial period. So, Peter Anker discovers this buried hoard of 30 objects.
Hmm.
Now, he basically, so if you look at the backstory, it is they actually have the first intent is they have this large evangelical mission that is taking funds from Denmark, and there are actually letters that say that we are wasting our money educating these so-called illiterates. Uh, and they come to us for free food, they come to us for everything, and then weekend they go back to worshipping their stones. So that's exactly what they talk about. And then Peter Anker is basically writing saying that cut the allocation for the church, give me money to safeguard my fort. Now the church has not done anything in the decades that I've been here. So in this context, imagine that a significant bronze hoard is found, which includes a Nataraja, brilliant Nataraja, which includes a brilliant Somaskanda, Shiva's family, and all that. Peter Anker can't come back home. And the tragic story is they are now and then he sells it to the Prince of Denmark, and they're now in the Royal Danish Museum. And the narration is Peter Anker bought it from the locals. They say that he bought it from the locals, but if you really look at the original Danish records, he gave the local priest a bag of rice
Hmm.
and betel nut leaves. That's it. So, so that is how the narrative, and he basically says these gods have lost power. There is no temple here that can take these, which is blatant lie. Today, if you look at the maps, the wall that he was building is just about 10 meters away from a Chola temple that still stands to this day, which is the Tarangambadi Masamanada temple. So basically, he abused his power as a colonial ruler in usurping these gods. So he says, I paid for it. He paid a bag of rice, and he took it back for obvious reasons. But then this is not something that is very. So you find it when another evangelist goes to Karnataka, he gives a pair of spectacles and takes few Hoysala sculptures, which are again sold to the Prince of Denmark. So a lot of these stuff happen. There is another interesting story of a Vishnu with Kanza that was found in a buried hoard just about a street away from a temple in Coimbatore, a thousand-year-old temple. The temple bids for it, but they're outbid. And you know who they're outbid by? They're outbid by Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India.
Oh.
And Lord Curzon takes it back and he bequeaths it to the V&A. It's now sitting in the V&A as the bequeath of Lord Curzon. So imagine, so these are kind of colonial narratives that at least they have to be realistic in what they portray. But then during that period, the scholarly intent that you talked about, yes, there are a few scholars who were well intentioned, like Ananda Kumaraswamy and all that, who did take away a few of ours to show that we were not the barbarians that they portrayed us to be. This was a very advanced civilization that had a really great art and quite surprising. But then there was a few, there were a few bad scholars even then. When I say even then, there are dime a dozen now. But there's one particular scholar that I was shocked because when I started reading about Pallava art, because if you look at the main dynasties back down south in South India, you're talking about the Chera, Cholas, Pandyas, and the Pallavas. And Pallavas were master craftsmen in stone.
Hmm.
So the Pallava edifices were beautiful monoliths carved out of granite, which is possibly the most hardest stone to carve. And they were really great. In the 7th and 8th centuries, they created such beautiful masterpieces. But what is interesting is there was no scholarly work on the Pallavas. Still, a French scholar who was based out of Pondicherry writes about it.
Hmm.
Dubriol is his name. And Dubriol today is celebrated as a great Dain who brought Pallava architecture, awareness of Pallava art to the world and all that. But then when we researched more, we realized that he basically had a dark history. So he comes in as a scholar who's well intentioned. He wants to excavate Buddhist ruins in Amaravati, and he goes and presents his findings back in Paris. No takers. They don't look at it as a great find, and he doesn't get his grant. So he basically, at that point, he meets a dubious Chinese scholar called C.T. Lu, who basically is set up his own art shop in Paris. It's called the Red Pagoda. There's a pagoda in Paris. It still exists to this day. and he's basically known world over today as somebody who smuggled Chinese art. So if you go to the British Museum, there is this huge 30 feet Amitabha Buddha that was taken out, I mean 30 feet stone sculpture. And City Lu today is known world over as a smuggler of Chinese artifacts. And there are some counter arguments saying that during the revolution, a lot of art pieces were destroyed
Hmm.
in China when there was an attempt to erase art. So he is seen as a rather savior, no, instead of getting them destroyed. But then, what is not known and not much research, unfortunately, the descendants of Lu have not yet opened the archives for the India side,
Hmm.
is because C.T. Lu actually contacts, meets with Dubriol, and Dubriol becomes his sourcing agent. So he, along with Tangavelu, who is a local resident in Pondicherry, they scout around Tamil Nadu and they chance upon this beautiful set of yoginis, which is yogini culture is very very rare to have in Tamil Nadu, South India. So it's more prevalent in central and eastern India. And they come across this beautiful site near Kanchipuram called Kaveri Pakam, and he sees a set of 28 of them, quietly takes them out. He doesn't tell anybody, spirits them out of Pondicherry, lines up in his house and photographs them and sends it to CT Lu, sends the photographs, and then he quietly ships every one of them out. Only one of the broken door guardians, he gives it to the Madras Museum today. The rest of all of these were shipped. So, in case there's a beautiful book by Padma Kainul on the displaced yoginis of Kaveri Pakam. And today they are dispersed all over the world. And it's not just these. We see that he's literally sold hundreds of bronzes uh, around the world via CT Lu. So basically, it's Dubrio to CT Lu, CT Lu to museums and collectors across the world. And this kind of information that has been hidden, and to me, the startling, if I can find this out with being an amateur, our own scholars would have definitely known about this. And for a long time, I think India has not been made aware of the extent of this collusion between the scholarly work and the art market. And when I say this, there are a lot of interesting cases that come up. In fact, there was so much of art that was leaving our shores that India and Italy actually championed the UN to come up with an international statuette. So basically, the art market is looking at India, Cambodia, Egypt, Italy as the source nations, as though we are some mine-rich, over-rich country where they can continuously mine for artifacts.
Yeah.
So at that point, India and Italy launch a kind of movement to force the UN to act, and the UN acts. So the UN comes up with this UN statuette of 1970, which is the much touted UN statuette for prevention of illicit trafficking of antiquities. But what is interesting is during that, there is an interesting paper submitted by joint paper submitted by India and Italy,
Hmm.
and India is basically submitting confidential police reports which talk about rampant theft across statewide. So they're tabulating statewide theft from the 1920s and 1930s, and these are running to hundreds
Hmm.
in that time. So we had our information of statewide theft of antiquities from temples, from heritage sites, and all these were actually presented in a global forum. And suddenly, after this statuette comes up, there is a pushback. Italy actually goes ahead and implements all the UN statuette is basically a kind of a you opt into it. So you
Hmm.
sign into it, and once the source nation, for example, signs and the market signs, all it says is you have to show proof that it was stolen and removed illegally from your country after 1970. Then you don't have to go to court. Basically, they have 30 days to refute your claim. If they can't, the object is yours. Simple. But it is not retrospective. So that means prior to 1970, you need to go to court. And a lot of people in the art market think anything prior to 1970 is somehow sacrosanct. It's a Lakshman Rekha. It miraculously washes stolen objects. It is not true. India has its own antiquity laws right from 1878 patrimony laws, starting from the Buried Treasure Trove Act. And a stolen object continues to be a stolen object. Just because the UN has come up with a non-retrospective statute doesn't mean that it can basically bestow good ownership on an object that was transferred before. So what happens? Italy actually forms this beautiful art squad under the center called the Carbonari Art Squad. They pick the best of their forces. They give them the best tools, lawyers, and all that. And surprise, surprise, they bring back so far 138,000
Wow,
artifacts.
that's a
To
huge number.
put things in perspective, there is a CAG report of 2013 on ASI and by the CAG. So when I say the CAG, it's not the famous CAG report. This is another CAG report. India between 1972 and 2000 brought back 19 artifacts, 19. 2000 to 2012, we brought back zero. So that was the pathetic state of affairs, and that's very, very important because between 2000 and 2012 was when a very important smuggler was nabbed in Rajasthan. Before we go into it, there are a couple of other cases. Quite often India seems to not realize. I don't know how to term it. We were more content with photo ops,
Hmm.
a big photo op, and then we would say big win. For example, I want to quote two, or rather, I'll show you three cases which are touted as India's great successes in restitution.
Hmm.
So when I say restitution, it means so a lot of people name, like for example, the German Chancellor gave back the Kashmir Tangapura Durga to our Prime Minister Modi. They say German Chancellor gives to Prime Minister Modi. It's wrong. Don't use the word gift. You give something that you own.
Yeah.
This was a stolen object. So the correct word to use, restitution, meaning give it back to the rightful owner. So in the art world, what these are termed as the high water mark of restitution cases are three important cases. One is called the Patur London Nataraja. The other one is called the Sivapuram Nataraja. A third one, which a lot of people don't know, which is not quite famous, is the Tiruvellikudi Nataraja. All three Natarajas were stolen out of India between 1960 and 1980. And these were landmark cases that should have paved the way for hundreds of objects to come back to India if we had only followed through. I'll just give you this example of this Sivapuram Nataraja case. What happens in 1956? A farm laborer is plowing his field. He comes across six buried bronzes, buried hoards, a Nataraja, Somaskanda, two Uma, one Samandar, and one Ganesha. So six bronzes he finds.
Hmm.
He informs authorities. The village administrative officer decides to donate it to the nearby temple, which is in Sivapuram. Temple authorities hand it over to a Stapati, who is the trained craftsman, to clean it because it is coming from burial. So there were a lot of incrustations. In 1956, the Stapati creates fakes, replicas, switches them, and keeps the originals with him. And we were equally blind that our own folks accepted the replicas. And what is interesting is in 1960,
Hmm.
the British King and Queen visit Chennai,
Hmm.
Madras that time, and there is a commemorative volume that has been bought out by an art collector called Lansdane. He brings out this commemorative book. On the back cover of the book is the original Nataraja of Sivapuram. And Lansdane basically buys these from the farmer
Hmm.
and they're spirited out via Bombay. British Museum curator Douglas Barrett, who's researching for a book on temple bronzes, basically visits Sivapuram in 1963 and he spots these and said, these are fakes, the originals are in Bombay. And he goes off. So our own people, by the time they go to Bombay, this Nataraja is sold to, at that time, the richest man in the world. I would say is not at that time. In the history of the planet, he was the richest man at that time, Norton Simon. So Norton Simon is famously said to have told in a New York Times interview saying that, hell yes, I know it's smuggled, so what? I buy hundreds of these every day, so what's the big deal kind of thing. So Norton Simon in 1960, around that time, buys this Nataraja
Hmm.
for $1 million. So India starts, as usual, going slow, trying diplomatic channels. In fact, there's a WikiLeaks cable on the Super Nataraja. So there's pressure exerted every side. And in 1972, India decides to have an out-of-court settlement with Norton Simon.
Hmm.
So what is interesting is this was a documented find. There were photographs of this Nataraja. There's no need for us to go for an out-of-court settlement. For some reason, we go for an out-of-court settlement. The settlement reads for 10 years, this Nataraja will be not in Nathan Simon's museum.
Hmm.
It will be in a public museum in the US and then it will be returned to India. No compensation will be paid to Norton Simon. So everybody is happy, big photo op, you know, big success for India. This is case is tainted as a great success. India standing up to the richest man in the world. Very good. 10 years later, this Nataraja came back. The case is currently closed in, not closed, it says all the accused arrested, no information on the balance five bronzes. What is interesting is the Somaskanda of the same set, documented, published by a Madras Museum book, is still in the Norton Simon Museum with the provenance plate. The display says Sivapuram, bought in 1972. It's still on display. And what is interesting is when India had signed this out of court settlement, they included a second line which is not in public domain, which allowed Norton Simon to buy any item of Indian art, provided it's already outside of India, for a period of 1 year, no questions will be asked. In this 1 year, Norton Simon pushed or laundered all his grey, more than 1,000 Indian art he actually accessioned in that 1 year moratorium period. India did not follow up, has still not followed up on any of these. So similarly, case of the London Nataraja. So this is on the Norton Simon Nataraja. The London Nataraja is even more spectacular. This was a case wherein a Nataraja was again a buried hoard was found. The laborer was not as good as the previous laborer. So the farmhand basically reported all it, but he kept the Nataraja. He actually buried it near his house, which was near a termite mound.
Hmm.
And then he later smuggled it out of a dealer in Bombay again into London. And there was a London dealer who offered it for sale to a Canadian company called Bumper Development Corporation, which was a big construction company in Calgary. So it again is a buried hoard. So it was sent to the British Museum for cleaning in London. So the British Museum, the restorer basically looked at it and he found that there were termite, the mound, the sand, secretions on the base, and he got suspicious, informed Scotland Yard. So everything beside was seized. India sued. There was a big question on who will sue. Landmark case. So this time, no out of court settlement. Experts were flown to London. The sand was tested, compared. So the termites basically gave evidence. So everything was done. The courts heard and they said, in the landmark judgment, they said for a Hindu temple, even if because this entire temple in Patur was actually ruined.
Hmm.
So the question was, who's the owner of this? Is it the government of India? So actually, the consort of Nataraja, Parvati, was also a bronze. She sued for her husband. So
Oh.
and then the British courts decided that the temple had a superior claim, and they said that a Hindu temple, even though there's a single brick extent, it can still be brought back to life, and they awarded the Nataraja back to India. And again, it came back to India, and surprisingly, it was stuck in customs for 14 years. And during that time, uh, the ASI did not give and they had to test it and give it a certificate to proceed with the prosecution. So it's again something that's hidden. So the Bombay dealer's name never came out.
Hmm.
India never went after the Canadian company.
Hmm.
We only brought back this single Nataraja. And in 2013, Bumper Development Corporation donated 80 plus Indian icons to the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. In 2014, they went bankrupt. They tried to sell their art via balance of their art via Sotheby's, via a lot of other auction houses, but they had no paperwork, obviously.
Hmm.
So nobody knows what happened to the collection. So these are some classic examples of how, if we had logically followed up, we could have eventually done better than the 19 that the CAG report. The last Nataraja again, to just put things in perspective, 1985, there is this big theft that happens in a temple called Thiruvelikudu. The the Tamil Nadu police go to London and they launch a joint raid on a gallery called the Everest Gallery in London. They seize 240 idols from the gallery. The gallery owner's house is raided. They seize 41 from his house. One of the Natarajas which they were looking for is sold to the Kimball Museum in America, which was the one from Tiruvallur. They took the priest to give evidence, and the priest said, "I recognize my Lord as a mother would recognize a son, because I bathe him, I feed him." So that was the evidence that was given. The Kimball Museum returned the Nataraja to India, but the case for the 281 seized idols is missing. Nobody knows what happened to the 281 that was seized in London. The files are missing both in India and in London. So there are a lot of such cases. So I'll just end this sad chapter with the last one, which is the most damaging one. In 1998, Peter Watson, BBC journalist, does a sting on a large auction house called Sotheby's. So basically, he has an inside mole who's basically telling him that these guys are engaging in art theft. So basically, Sotheby's was sending their representatives into Italy, sourcing objects, and then bring them out, laundering them via Switzerland, and then bring them out to London to sell. During the course of that investigation, he comes across a similar operation in India by Sotheby's. So Peter Watson comes to India. In fact, his book, he did this 60 minutes with BBC, and then he brought the rest out as a book called Sotheby's: The Inside Story in 1998. And there, it's famously said he met three major smugglers out of India. The Bombay brothers, as he mentions, they said, "Do you want the Taj Mahal? Let us know. We'll ship it out in parts to you." This famously on camera, they're supposed to have said. And then he talks about this big smuggler in Rajasthan. And apparently, Sotheby's had two of their executives who came to India, stayed with Vaman Gia, who was the smuggler. They used to go with scholars, Indian scholars, on recce trips where they would be shown objects in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, uh, name it. These guys would pick and choose the objects that would sell in Western auctions. So this was not some rampant, thief stealing something. This was an organized plunder on an industrial scale, targeted looting. And in fact, these guys used to go back and write sales reports and file travel bills and all with Sotheby's. Even those are actually enclosed in the book. So he published this book in 1998. As usual, Indian law enforcement took 4 years to arrest Vaman Gia in 2002. They raided his warehouse in Delhi in 2003, yielded 836 objects, of which 400 were certified antiquities buried in his farmhouse. Vaman Gia was acquitted in 2013 for want of evidence. Not a single, he's supposed to have confessed to selling 10,000 works of Indian art via Sotheby's and a host of 4 Swiss companies, all named. Not a single one of those sculptures ever came back to India, and Vaman Gia was acquitted by a high court, and ASI did not even bother to appeal the verdict. In 2005, a buyer in London who had bought stuff which was linked to Vaman Gia basically handed over a Natesa stone from Badoli in Rajasthan, wherein the robbers had actually kept a fake in the site and they had smuggled the original. He got scared that when Vaman was arrested, it will come to him. He gave it to the Indian High Commission in London. The news was kept away from India. It was on display in the High Commission in London from 2005 till November of 2019, when we launched a campaign and we requested them to return it. And last November, finally, the Natesa that was on display was shipped to India because nobody knew how the statue was there. In fact, it was the evidence that our courts were looking for, and it was hiding in plain sight in London. And Vaman is still a free man.
Stay tuned for part 2 releasing tomorrow. Keep watching New India Junction. Namaste.